Well, another Monday is here. I hope you guys really have a good day today. And you know, on the final slide of these things, I always say have a great day and be careful out there. I'll have that at the end too, but I'm going to go ahead and say it now. I hope you have a really great week and be careful, don't get hurt out there. It's like a lot of stuff can go wrong in the shop. Most of you guys know that. One of the funny things I remember was when I was telling my students to be really careful when they were using a grinder, and don't try to grind anything really little that you were having to hold with your hands on it. And one of the students says, yeah, it'll take your fingerprints off if you do that. And this one girl said, how'd she put that? She says, my aunt doesn't have any fingerprints because she's a massage therapist. And apparently she had rubbed her fingerprints off. And I says, well, she'd make a good cat burglar. And she says, no, she wouldn't steal cats. She's allergic to them. She didn't understand what I was talking about at all. This is a PCV diagram. We got an emission crash course we're going to do today. And a lot of the times we think we understand more about the PCV system than we do, but one way or another, when the PCV system is not working, if you take the oil filler cap off and you see this junk right here, then you got a pretty good idea that the PCV system's not working the way it should. There can be several reasons for that. And this is basically an oversimplified drawing. This oil temperature has got to be higher than boiling for the PCV system to pull the water out of it, because every gallon of gas you burn, you create a gallon of water. So some of that water is going to get past the rings and go into the crankcase. And if you just run the engine when it's cold a lot, and like that water doesn't, you know, so that the oil doesn't ever reach the temperature, the boiling temperature of water, then the PCV system won't be able to get it all out of there, and it's going to gather on the insides of the crankcase. This right here eventually turns to ugly dark sludge that just clogs things up and all that. But what happens is this vacuum pulls air. The air starts here, goes through here, it's drawn through the crankcase by the PCV valve. And you're going to typically find, even if it's on a straight 6, you're going to find the PCV valve on the back or the front, and then you'll find the closure hose on the opposite end. The newer ones have got with the PCV getting its air from the zip tube between the mass airflow sensor and the throttle body, because that air needs to be metered. You can take the oil filler cap off with the engine running and watch your fuel trims, and the air that's being drawn unmetered past that oil filler cap will actually start to affect your fuel trims. It's not hard to verify that when you got your scan tool hooked up. Take the oil filler cap off and watch your fuel trims. You'll see them starting to change because you got unmetered air there. Well, not all of the PCV valves are made like the one I'm going to show you in the next slide. A lot of the PCV valves, like some of the Chevys, have got just a little orifice built into the valve cover. And some Chevys will have a PCV valve that looks like a regular PCV valve, but all it is a hollow shell with a little hole in the bottom of it. But here's another thing: if you put the wrong PCV valve on some of these vehicles so that it's flowing too much air, you know, you need to put the right one. Put the wrong one on there, it can affect your fuel trims. Like if you got fuel trims that are wonky and you're trying to figure out what's going on, and somebody has just replaced the PCV valve, then you need to be making sure the PCV valve they put on there was the right one. Because I ran into that when I was in the field. Wrong PCV valve will make your fuel trims go crazy. I mean, go into double digits, I'm talking about, if you're not really, you know, and if you're looking for something like that. Of course, the least little bit of thing can affect fuel trims. It doesn't have to be very much, because it's such a fine adjustment that you want the fuel trims to be close to 0, and if they're up around 12 or 13, you're saying, man, what's going on here, you know? And so a mass airflow sensor that's just skewed a little bit can cause those fuel trims to go wonky too, even though it never throws a mass airflow code, even though you may look at the mass airflow and it looks just fine. If it's just a tiny bit out of kilter, it'll affect those fuel trims. That's how critical all this is. But anyway, you can look at that, and you might notice in the old air filters back in when the carburetor days, whenever the inside the air filter was a PCV filter, but because you're pulling air through the crankcase with that PCV valve, you want this air to be filtered. That's what that PCV filter, that crankcase filter, was for. in the breather, but a lot of people will just pull a piece of foam out of there and throw it away. And when the PCV system gets to where it's not working good, you're going to see oil in here. Now, when the engine's idling, you ought to be able to take this closure hose loose, put your finger over it. You know, I'm talking about take it loose here and put your finger over it here. You ought to feel a vacuum where that PCV system is pulling air through there. If you don't feel a vacuum there, you probably need to make sure you got good vacuum feed here and so on. And, you know, make sure that the whole thing is clear and not clogged. And when the PCV system doesn't draw enough air through, moisture gathers in a crankcase, you get this milky residue that eventually turns into sludge. Now this is the PCV valves that we've been familiar with for so many years. For years and years ago, a lot of Asian car makers, you might have noticed, just had a little bitty, looked like a vacuum nipple on the side of the breather, and it was a little tiny orifice. That's the only thing they had for a PCV system. Of course, some of them still had PCV valves, but I was interested in seeing how some of them, they just had a vacuum, you know, little metered vacuum pulling out of the crankcase. That was figure they didn't need the PCV valve. But if that little hole stops up in that, you know, orifice in that PCV nipple, is bad. Now this thing right here, you can look at this, study that a little bit. Idle speed, high vacuum, moderate flow. Engine loaded, see the spring-loaded nature of this thing? And then whenever you backfire, this is actually slams that PCV valve shut. And so, I mean, if the intake, you got an induction backfire, you know, that'll slam the PCV valve shut, and it's designed to do that. And so, and it's got a tapered end on it, so that as it floats up and down, it regulates PCV flow. We don't often think about that, but the Corvair was the first one that had PCV valve. Now, EGR systems differ in design and feedback, but they all do the same job. Exhaust gas is recirculated to prevent NOx formation, and since exhaust gas is inert, and since it has, you know, mass, it takes place of some of the OT in the mix and cools the combustion chamber. You don't want the combustion chamber going over 2,500 degrees during the combustion cycle, and it gets really, really hot in here. And, you know, of course, the hottest part of the whole motor is the cylinder head, because that's where it's, you know, the cylinder walls don't get nearly as hot as the cylinder head, but they got the cooling system jacket, and, you know, you've got restricted holes in the gasket right here. They let the coolant flow through the cylinder head more slowly than it's flowing everywhere else, because you want it to take the time to gather the heat. I got some head gaskets one time from Felpro. For this guy that was putting some head gaskets, one of my students, on a Taurus. And he laid them head gaskets out side by side. He was pretty sharp. And he noticed that the little bitty holes in the original gaskets where the water left the block and went into the head, instead of having those little small holes in there, for some weird reason that Felpro gasket had holes the same size as the you know, the hole in the block in the head, which would have mean the water would have flowed through too quick, which meant he would have burned the engine up. So I called the parts guy. The parts guy called Felpro. Felpro said, "Oh no, you know, send those back. You don't need to use those." Think about it. If you'd have just got the gaskets out and he'd have popped them on there, and this thing overheated and destroyed the engine or cracked the head or something like that, then it would have been because of those Felpro gaskets, and the Felpro people didn't want to wear that. You know, because that's that's money that's got to flow from somewhere to fix that. If the mechanic didn't do anything wrong, except, you know, they assumed Felpro knew what they were doing, just popped the gaskets on there. Anyway, I got off of EGR and into that because it came to mind. But that you're only recycling about 5% of your exhaust gas. This is really not accurate because the pipe ain't that big. All right, let me look at this next thing. So you notice the exhaust gas cools when it's going through this pipe. That's why they got a sort of a long pipe. Diesel engines, a lot of them have EGR coolers. So the inert gas doesn't have to be hot when it goes in there. So they let it run through this pipe and cool off a little bit. And then whenever you're not idling, you don't really, unless it's a diesel, you know, some diesels, if you open the EGR valve on a diesel using your scan tool, you might notice it idles really quiet, a lot quieter than a diesel would. But the EGR won't flow at idle except on some diesels. And if it's flowing at idle, you're going to have a hot intake. Now you can touch it with your hand. Within a minute of starting it, that intake's going to get really hot. And this is the Ford way of doing it right here. There's an orifice in that tube. When you got pressure flowing past an orifice, it goes up on one side of the orifice, it drops on the other side. The DPFE uses that to determine, its feedback. In OBD2 systems, it's required to have a closed loop system, but some I found out, some, like my Jeep Cherokee, did not have an EGR valve on it. And the thing about it is, if it can satisfy NOx emissions with just the catalyst and not an EGR, then some of the automakers would leave the EGR off. I'd seen that on some Fords. It would come from the factory on some of your 2.9 Broncos with that EGR thing capped off from the factory with a metal plate. And it's all about satisfying federal emission regulations of that year. Anyway, some Asian EGR system uses a sensor to measure the temperature of the exhaust gas as it flows through the valve. Now, this preceded OBD2. Like, for example, OBD2 didn't become a thing until about 1994. It started appearing on some of the Thunderbirds that I was working on, and by 1997 it was pretty much required on everything except some of the 1-ton gas burner trucks, and then by 98 everything had to have it. But this same system you're seeing here appeared in 1991 on Lincolns with 4.6 liter engines in them, so that was the first time they started doing that. General Motors, for their feedback on EGR, they used the oxygen sensor, because whenever EGR is flowing, you're going to see your oxygen sensor signal drift in a direction that looks rich. And so GM would factor that in, because they would know that your oxygen sensor is going to drift in a rich direction, and they didn't want it. It would say, I know I'm opening the EGR valve, so whenever it had PCM controlled EGR, and I'm going to watch for that in the oxygen sensor, and we'll factor that into the fuel trim. So they were pretty sharp about that. But you can also watch your oxygen sensor and see that if you tell the EGR to open, like I used to put a vacuum hose on here, and I put a vacuum on the EGR with the engine idle, and I wanted to see the engine idle a little bit rough. If you apply vacuum to that EGR and you don't see the engine idle rough, then the EGR is either not opening or it's clogged, and that's really important if you got a PO401 code. All right, that was didn't do that right. Okay. All right, a PO401 code is a result of this, and so it's the closed loop EGR system on OBD2, no matter how it works, must detect this and flag the lack of flow. Now, on the newer Ford systems, they put the whole thing together in one package. Here's your DPFE and here's your EGR vacuum regulator. I thought that was really interesting. This was a girl student with a green fingernail polish, and I took a picture of it in the school putting an EGR valve on a Crown Victoria, and that's where it bolted up. But this clogged up junk right here, I don't know how many of these times we've had to pull these out. Anybody that's been working on cars very long, very seriously, has had to take a throttle body off and clean this out one way or another. But that stuff left to clog out. PCV steam from the PCV system. Whenever you shut off the car, that PCV steam, it tends to settle in places, and it's basically it clogs up the back of the throttle plate and all that kind of thing. But that sludge is going to find its way in there to clog that EGR one way or another. And not all of that's PCV steam, but that's one of the places sludge comes from. Alright, if you charge a person for parts or labor you didn't deliver, is that stealing? Yes. It really is. I put these questions in here for my students when I was teaching, just to make them think. Because a lot of people have the idea that if they can get away with it, it's okay, but it's just really not, The evaporative system prevents hydrocarbons that evaporate from the fuel tank from escaping into the air by storing them and then drawing them through the engine. This is basically, where you're going to see this. This won't always be back here. Sometimes it's up here, sometimes it's about halfway back, and like on this one right here, and this is kind of how it works. You got a fuel tank pressure sensor. That's for the enhanced evaporative system that can tell when there's a leak in the system. And what it'll do is earlier system didn't have a vent solenoid, but the OBD2 enhanced one did. Fresh air comes in here, the vent solenoid, when it's going to check for a leak, will close that vent solenoid, and it'll apply a few inches of water vacuum, not very much vacuum at all, on this system, and that will lower the pressure in the tank, and then it will clamp that off and keep that held, and it watches for that to bleed off with this fuel tank pressure sensor. That's how that works. And then whenever it releases the vent solenoid, it actually notices how fast that vacuum bleeds off. So if the vacuum doesn't bleed off fast enough, it means there's something clogged up. Now early on, some of them would clog this vent solenoid up, you know, in dusty conditions, and they had a little screen built in there. And so they stopped, almost immediately, and whenever this started to be a problem, they would actually filter the fresh air coming in through a filter that was mounted remotely that had a hose going to this. So you can see that air being pulled through here through a filter to keep dust out of the evaporative canister and the vent solenoid, because that did turn out to be a problem on some of the ones that we worked on. And I had some pictures of that. I forgot to put them in here. The early EVAP system didn't check for leaks. I remember those. They had the little purge valve was built right on the canister, and you had a vacuum signal that came from the carburetor, right? And what it would do is whenever you were driving, you know, whenever you'd get EGR and purge at the same time on the old ones. So EGR would only get vacuum when the engine was, when you're off idle driving with the engine warm, you know, because they had a thermal vacuum switch to prevent it from getting it when it's cold. So engine warm, you know, you got your ported vacuum. Notice that this vacuum port's above the throttle plate, so it doesn't really have any vacuum until you open the throttle. When you open the throttle, you start getting a vacuum here, and it goes to the EGR valve through that thermal vacuum switch, but it also opens the purge valve, and it begins to purge the canister. Now you notice this, we have a bigger port right here, but you're also going to have a pipe that's not easy to see here, that's coming from the gas tank. So you got a pipe coming from the gas tank bringing the vapor to here. It's stored in the activated charcoal, and so this right here, it's a little different. This one here didn't have the vent like that one. It was, some of the earlier ones would purge air through the bottom of the canister when they didn't need to check them for leaks. But a lot of the times you'd have a cap over here that was just a vent, I mean, so that it keeps dirt daubers out of there, and it would pull the air in there, pull it through, and then it would go to the engine. Now that was when they first started putting canister purge on there. If the canister was saturated though, after we got fuel injection and all, it would actually cause you to have fuel trim issues and all that, because people packing a gas tank. You know, the fuel tank's always supposed to have an air space in it. It doesn't fill all the way up to the top, and so basically this orifice here, see, would bring the gasoline vapors in there, and then of course they were purged out into the intake. You know, they had that one. They showed, here's the PCV valve right here. That's the way they had that, and sometimes that's the way it was. They did it a bunch of different ways. One of the things I used to do though, and on the General Motors vehicles in the early 70s, they would connect the distributor vacuum advance at the OEM. They would just connect the distributor vacuum advance to the dadgum manifold vacuum, and that would cause it to retard the timing a little bit when you gave it the gas, because they were afraid it was going to ping, I guess. And so what we did was, I would go, and somebody, you know, would bring their car in there, I would re-pipe that so that it was ported vacuum. I'd use I'd tee off of the ported vacuum that was going to the canister and EGR, and hook that to the distributor vacuum advance, and it would go from being lackluster on a takeoff to just about boiling the tires when you took off. It would give it a lot more zoom if the timing would advance as you were giving it the gas, because that just gives you a, you know, a little more power just because of the timing advance. Now General Motors fighting that ping hooked it to their manifold vacuum. That was a factory thing. I saw that a lot on a lot of cars in the early 70s, early and mid 70s. All right, this is the EVAP system stuff right here. You know, got your EVAP system monitor. I borrowed this slide from a teaching program one time that we had at the school. Now, it's the monitor looks for a leak that's from 20 to 40 thousandths of an inch. That is a very small leak. Vent solenoid, that's one front like a Chevy truck. That's your fuel tank pressure sensor, and there's a shot of your canister right there, what it looks like. And so that'd be your purge flow sensor. They look all kinds of different ways. Now, here's a tip about the purge flow sensor. If the purge flow sensor is stuck open so that it's passing air all the time, when you gas up, that vapor from the gas tank that's being pushed out of the gas tank will go straight into the intake, and it will actually condense in there. And when you first go to start the engine, it will wet the plugs and make it hard to start. I don't know how many times I've seen that. My son's pickup, he had a 2013 F-150, that right after he bought it, he was noticing it was really hard to start right after he gassed it up. And I told him that's going to be the canister purge valve, because those canister purge valves, when they're open, it makes them hard to start right after you gas them up. That's the only time you'll ever notice a problem with them. But it'll also throw you a, evaporative system code, P0455 or whatever. If that valve is not clamping off properly whenever it shuts off to check for leaks, it's going to throw you a code. And even if you smoke test it, you typically won't see that because it's inside that canister purge valve, see. Proven character. If you open your paycheck one Friday and find out the payroll department made a mistake, gave you $100 more than you should have been paid, what's the right thing to do? What would you do? Well, a lot of times you might figure, well, they owe me that anyway because they don't pay me enough, but there were several times the service manager was trying to coax me into getting paid a different way than I was getting paid. But I was happy the way I was getting paid. I didn't like that one particular service manager. You had to watch that guy with both eyes. And every now and then, when I would turn like 60 or 70 or 80 hours in a week, he would actually silently or quietly tell the payroll people to pay me commission instead of my straight salary that I was getting paid. And of course, I liked the straight salary at that particular place because whenever times were good, I looked after them. When times were bad, they looked after me. So whenever work was a little bit slow in the fall, when the peanut festival was in town, then I would always get the same amount of money, and it was a nice flat paycheck. I always knew how to budget my money. But whenever I was working on commission, if you have a bad week, you have one bad week. I don't know if you've experienced this. It'll take you a month to catch up or 6 weeks. If you have one bad week, you get so far behind on everything. And so I liked the way I was getting paid. Well, instead of the money I was used to getting, they would give me a paycheck that was gigantic. And I would go to the payroll department. I say, how did this happen? What's going on here? They say, oh, I'm sorry, we forgot and accidentally paid you a commission. Well, the service manager told them to do it because he was trying to say, look how much money you make. Eventually, the way they started paying me, and he was the one that pushed this. They paid me a guarantee of 40 hours a week plus whatever I turned over that. Of course, I always beat that. But anyway, the long and the short of it was, they were saying up front, they said he's the only person we've ever seen that when we pay him too much money, he'll come and tell us to take it out of the next check. And that's what I do, because I don't want anything that I'm not getting earned. Furthermore, whenever the service manager came to me one day and he says, I'm going to put this guy you're training on the line here, doing drivability work. And he had got to where he's pretty good at it because he's pretty sharp. He says, and every hour he turns, I will pay you $1 for every hour he turns. And I said, why don't you give that money to him? He needs it worse than I do. I didn't like that service manager's carrots that he would hold out, because it was very annoying to me about how when you get used to getting that money, he would take it away from you. He did that to the service riders. He gave them an impetus by saying, I'll give you so much for every transmission service you sell, and blah, blah, blah. And for about a year, they got used to that $300 or $400 extra a month. And without warning, he just came and said, I'm cutting this off. And one of them says, well, I was counting on that to pay some of my bills. And he says, well, it's one away, and so I didn't want any of his incentives. I just want what I know I'm going to get paid for a week. And, don't dangle a carrot and try to trick me. And that guy was real slippery. You got to really watch him. All right, the air injection reactor, that's what General Motors called it, system. Ford called it thermactor. But since the mid-1960s, was mandatory in the early 70s. You had an air pump that was pulled by a belt. A lot of people took that belt off of that thing, and they would cap these places where the air was pumped into the heads. What that's basically was supposed to do, when the engine's really cold, and you got cold enrichment going on, you got hydrocarbons in the exhaust coming out of there because everything's so cold and rich, it's got to run that way. And so they would shoot some fresh air in there, and what that would do, it's like fanning a fire. It would light off any hydrocarbons. They were nice and hot, but they hadn't burned, and they were coming out of the chamber. And it would light those off, and it would eliminate those hydrocarbons. And at the very worst, you'd have a little bit of CO. not CO2, CO, which is carbon and oxygen, one molecule of oxygen, which is very poisonous, carbon monoxide. But anyway, the CO would be handled this way, and what it would do is it would initially pump the air into the exhaust right up where it was coming out. It wasn't always like this. Sometimes, like on some of your Ford V8s, it was pumped into the back of the head, back there where the exhaust, where it would make it to the exhaust. Anyway, and it would have a check valve in there to keep the exhaust from pulsing back into here and messing things up. But this is the old way of doing it right here. Okay, it was all about helping get rid of the cold AC and helping the catalyst deal with CO and NOx, because it would go downstream. When they started putting catalyst on there, it would go downstream in between the two bricks. You got a front brick that handles oxides of nitrogen. You got the back brick that handles carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons. And it would pump oxygen between those two bricks. You didn't need oxygen to go in ahead of the NOx, the light-off converter, but these older air injection systems had belt-driven pumps with pulse air injection valves. And some of them didn't even have an air pump. They just had a valve that would take advantage of exhaust pulses to draw air in there, like the one you see on the left there. The one on the right is your belt-driven old style, basically with the carburetor. And you notice how it was pumping the exhaust in there the same way the, it was shown on the previous slide. Of course, your newer systems have got electric air pumps, and they basically do all kinds of funky stuff besides what were doing to start with, but they're still doing the same job. They're basically pumping the air in there to help with the hydrocarbons on cold enrichment situations, and they help the catalytic converter. Trigger secondary air pump. This is an electric air pump that got on a lot of new ones to power up the pump. It grounds secondary air solenoid. Go back and look at those other slides. This thing won't let me back up when I'm recording a video, and it irritates the stew out of me. But anyway, all right, taking something without permission. If you borrow something from your employer without asking and never return it, is the same as stealing. There was a wrecker driver a long time ago, and they caught him that he had stolen a case of motor oil, because he has keys to the shop, at night, because he was a wrecker driver. He was a young guy, made a lot of money, making $1,000 a week or something driving a wrecker. But they found out he had stolen a case of motor oil. I don't know how they found it out. Well, about 4 or 5 years later, maybe 2 years later, it seemed like it was, there was a cigar box in the cashier's office. Now this is, crazy as all get out, but a lot of these car dealerships, you'll have a cigar box with money in it in the cashier's office. I don't know why they do it that way. I've seen that in more than one dealership, and I'll tell you a story about that later. But the $1,700 was in that cigar box. The cigar box went missing, and everybody that had a key to the shop was forced to take a lie detector test, including the service manager. But before they did that, the guy that had stolen a case of motor oil, they fired him just on general principle, because he had, the boss man was so angry that somebody stole that money. Well, it turned out the person that stole it was the cashier, and she had just quit the job the day before. I don't know why they didn't finger her for that to start with, but nobody in the shop at the time was guilty of stealing that money. It was that cashier that took it. Anyway, the catalyst efficiency, catalysts have been on cars since like 1975. The light-off cat on our newer cars takes care of your NOx, and the oxidation cat takes care of, you can see what comes out of here. Your NOx is gone by the time it goes through this converter, because basically this converter here separates the oxygen from the nitrogen. They get bound together when the temperature goes too high. That's what EGR is supposed to help prevent. But some of it's going to make it past the EGR system. There's going to be hot pockets in there where you've got oxides of nitrogen. The reason it's NOx is because X can be any number. It can be 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, various different oxygen. It's not nitrous oxide all the time like you'd use in your hot rod. So anyway, it separates the oxygen and the nitrogen, and what you got coming out of here, which wasn't even dealt with HC, which is unburnt fuel, CO, which is when only one molecule of oxygen bound to the carbon. This is when none bounded to the carbon. This is when oxygen, whenever the burn's taking place. And when it's too rich, a little too rich, a lot too rich, you get this, a little too rich, you get that. and then you got nitrogen. This is the three gases that are coming through here. Of course, there's going to be a little oxygen too coming through here. And what comes out of this oxidation catalyst, you're adding 2 molecules of oxygen to this, 1 molecule of oxygen to this. The nitrogen just goes on through. And what comes out the back of this thing, there's going to be water vapor too, which H2O. You got CO2, which doesn't hurt a thing, that feeds the grass and the plants. I don't care what they say about that climate change junk. H2O, nitrogen, and O2 is coming out. Now your three-way catalyst is the only one monitored with oxygen sensors. The oxidation catalyst is not monitored. They want to know that this one's storing oxygen because that's important. Alright, upstream O2S should look like that, downstream. This is when it's working right and it's storing oxygen. If these are switching at about the same rate, it's not storing oxygen. You're going to get a PO420 or a PO430 or something like that. But one time on a car I was working on, I pulled that code, determined the catalyst was bad, and I told them to order a catalytic converter for it. They didn't ask me if it was the front or the rear cat that I was ordering. The line mechanic, this catalyst came in, the line mechanic popped that catalyst on there. They came back with the same doggone code. I says, no, we didn't order the right catalyst, so we had to order the right one, put it on there to get that mess straightened out. If you buy aftermarket catalyst, unless it's a good one like Walker or something like that, if it's a cheap Chinese aftermarket catalyst, and you're putting it on there to try to get rid of a catalyst efficiency code, you may have a comeback on that, because some of I've had that. We've actually replaced some of the catalysts because they didn't want to spend all the big money, and we let a muffler shop replace it with a catalyst that they had, that was just like a generic catalytic converter, and it wouldn't work right, and it wouldn't last, and you'd start getting this. So anyway, they put this one on here. Well, about several years later, when I was at college, this girl came in. She said that she had a check engine light. Pull a PO30 code. Go to the dealer. It's under warranty. She went to the dealer. They put the wrong catalyst on there. Just like what happened to me at the Ford place. And when they brought it back, I looked under there, brand new shiny catalyst. She said, I still got the same light. Well, they hadn't replaced this one. They had to replace that one. Understanding that is important, guys. All right, this is a catalyst efficiency, what it's supposed to look like if it's working right. And this is from a scan tool. This is at college when we were working on a Jeep. Now this catalyst, quite frankly, had been gutted, because the guy that's my doctor had bought a Jeep and somebody had gutted the catalyst, and he was seeing a check engine light, and this is what the one looked like with a gutted catalyst. It was just an empty shell back there, and see, they were both switching together. That is the 1-1 and 1-2 in front of the catalyst, behind the catalyst. See, this is what it looked like after we replaced the catalyst. You got a nice lazy signal right here that's up there, and usually above half a volt. That's what you're looking for. Long fuel trim will add or subtract fuel as needed to keep short fuel trim near zero. It's basically a balancing act. Long fuel trim is like a course adjustment. If your short fuel trim maxes out because there's a vacuum leak, the long fuel trim will start stepping up very slowly, and it'll keep stepping up until short fuel trim goes back to zero. So if you want to know if you got a problem when you're looking in there, don't look at your short fuel trim, look at your long fuel trim. Now if you pull your battery cable off and clear your memory, put it back on, then you're going to see, and you see the short fuel trim numbers walking really fast in one direction, you know you got a problem. And so rich exhaust will drive it lean, which would be going that direction. Lean exhaust drives it rich. And so it can go farther than this. It doesn't just stop at 25%. A lot of it will go up in the 30s. But it's all about keeping the catalytic converter happy. And I will tell you something that a lot of people don't know. If you take that front oxygen sensor offline, so that the engine controller knows that front oxygen sensor is not dependable, it will begin to adjust fuel trim based on the rear oxygen sensor. There's almost nobody that knows that, but there was some CarQuest guys that was talking about that, instructors that said they actually experimented with that. It was on a Dodge, and it's probably like that on the rest of them too. Why? Because they want to keep the catalytic converter happy. They don't want it overheating. See, that's the thing. Now when you're repairing a too lean or too rich load, if you say, found the vacuum leak, got it fixed, clear the PCM's memory either with your scan tool or pull the battery cables off. Watch the short fuel trim when you start it up and closed loop kicks in. If it starts to move away from zero really, really fast, you're not done with the repair. Now, if you don't take the battery cable off, and it's still got those same old fuel trim adaptive memory, you may see it walking in the opposite direction really fast. So I like to clear everything out while I'm doing the repair, and then put it back together. And if that fuel trim, when it closes loop, and it'll tell you on a scan tool if you're in closed loop, if it stays close to 0, then you fixed your leak. If it walks one way or another, you need to go looking for something else. Always reset, keep alive memory after performing a repair to clear any skewed data out of the PCM's tables. PCM needs to start over with base data and relearn. That's if you're cleaning the throttle body, or like I told you about my dad replacing the thermostat because of it was running too cold in my mother's 91 Chrysler. And he just replaced the thermostat. And then he said, well, I think I'll change the oil. About 2 weeks later, change the oil, called me up. He goes, all I did is change the oil, now it won't idle. And I got to thinking, well, it was running rich a long time, you know, because it was running cold a long time. It's probably got a lot of gasoline. It was in there in PCV systems, picking up that gas. Fuel trims are skewed. I told him on the phone, I said, take the battery cable off for a little bit and put it back on. He did that, took care of the whole problem because of adaptive learning. Always view and record freeze frame data. That will tell you what was going on when the code was set. And it kind of looks like this. See your fuel system status. It says closed loop, use an oxygen sensor. Calculated load value, engine coolant temp was 201, short fuel. This was on a P0171 code, see. So I'm wanting to know when that code was set, what was happening in real time. Now the Chrysler people have what they call a similar conditions window that they would use with the old ERB3, which was a pretty good scan tool. And the secondary air status, when it's checking the secondary air system, and sometimes it does that, it watches the oxygen sensors while it starts pumping air downstream. You know what I mean? And so that's pretty good stuff. They even told how fast they were driving, engine RPM and all that. Now you may not see the reason for your fuel trim, for your P0171 here. You may not see it, but at the same time, of course, look at this. On the long fuel trim you had 11.72, see? So this one here had gone up to keep this one near 0. Because if it can get this one to stay near 0, it's protecting the catalytic converter. Anyway, learn to look at all that. It's always a really good idea. Don't erase your codes before you capture your freeze frame data. I don't care if you do it with your cell phone, but you kind of need that to go back and look at. And see, ignition time in advance can be different. If you got cop coil system, it can change the ignition timing on each cylinder. And if the knock sensor picks up that a knock is happening on cylinder number 4, and you got cop coil, it'll retard the timing, on just that one cylinder. So that's important to know too. Well, this is the end of this. We've been here 37 minutes. I hope you guys lasted till the end of it. If you didn't, I hope you last till the end of it next time. Have a great week. Let's be careful out there, and I will see you guys next time.